Hi, this is Anthony. Welcome back to my show. In today's episode of my show, I'm going to be looking at a wide variety of topics, mainly answers to questions and comments that I've gotten on a wide variety of videos that I've recently done. And I think you'll find them interesting, so please do keep on watching until the end. As I launch right in, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Yesterday, I uploaded a video where I report on a connection that somebody else found, although I've never encountered it before online, discussing a comic book story from 1960 by the company that eventually became Marvel. And it was a story created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby about a space villain named Xenu, who has very similar characteristics to Xenu, the intergalactic villain at the heart of the OT3 level within Scientology, which of course was created by science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard. And it's believed that the first time that the story was developed was in the late 1960s. So here's a question for one of my long-term viewers. They seem very similar, but if they really are the same, I don't understand why Marvel didn't sue Hubbard after Hubbard had some real money, but before Hubbard became too influential. Was Hubbard's book published after the copyright ended on the original comic strip? Occasionally I hear a fan fiction around various characters created by different writers. I think some studios have produced Sherlock Holmes movies or TV shows that weren't true to the original stories written by Doyle. I don't know what the legal requirements are for doing something like that. Was the Hubbard book written as fiction or as a religious text? J.R.R. Tolkien's son went through his father's notes and wrote things explaining more of the background of Tolkien's works. Are you saying that Scientology is doing the same thing with Hubbard's works, but only revealing the background to people who rise to a certain level in Scientology? So there's a lot of points to cover there. First, as far as why Marvel Comics or their successor Disney did not pursue any legal action against Hubbard or Scientology for what seems to be clear connections between the original comic book story and the OT3 story is probably this. Jack Kirby worked in the comic industry from 1936 probably until he died in 1994. For a lot of that time he worked for Marvel and its various predecessor companies such as Timely and Atlas Comics until 1970, when he switched to working for DC Comics for a period of time, partly because he didn't believe that he got the recognition that he deserved for creating so many characters. So you have to see, in the comic industry at the time, you were often working for a company as an employee, and so the company owned all of the creations and ideas that you came up with, as well as keeping the physical artwork, which, as you can imagine, became quite valuable. I think when he switched to DC in 1970 that they gave him better terms than he'd been getting at Marvel. I think at a later period he did switch back and worked at Marvel and perhaps some independent comic book publishers. Stan Lee was related to the publisher of what eventually became Marvel and worked for them or was connected to that company, even if just in movie cameos, and its successors from 1939 until his death in 2018. Over the years, together and individually or with others, they came up, that is Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, they came up with perhaps hundreds if not thousands of different characters. Many of them just appeared in a 12-page story in a single comic book title that may have run for just a short period of time before being canceled. My guess is there's plenty of characters that they came up with that they have no recollection of, as it literally was a story that took them about 18 hours to produce and then they moved on to the next thing. Also, the story of Xenu, which is now a lot of people know about and you can find it in all kinds of places on the internet, is still kept secret within Scientology until you get to the OT3 level. And even then, you're not supposed to discuss it with anyone, even if they've also reached that level. It seems that it, for the most part, was not known by anyone in the public, that is, outside of Scientology, until the early 1970s. Here's some information adapted from an article on Wikipedia. Despite the Church of Scientology's efforts to keep the story secret, details have been leaked over the years. OT3 was first revealed in Robert Kaufman's 1972 book called Inside Scientology, in which Kaufman detailed his own experiences of OT3. It was later described in a 1981 Clearwater Sun article and came to greater public fame in a 1985 court case brought against Scientology by Lawrence Wollersheim. The church failed to have the documents sealed and attempted to keep the case file checked out by a reader at all times, but the story was summarized in the Los Angeles Times and detailed in William Poundstone's book called Bigger Secrets in 1986 from information presented in the Wallersheim case. In 1987, a book called L. Ron Hubbard, Messiah or Madman, quoted the first page of OT3 and summarized the rest of its content. This book claimed to be co-authored by L. Ron Hubbard Jr., also known as Ronald DeWolf, one of L. Ron Hubbard's children. Since then, news media mentioned Xenu in coverage of Scientology or its celebrity proponents such as Tom Cruise. In 1987, the BBC's investigative news series Panorama aired a report titled The Road to Total Freedom, which featured an outline of the OT3 story in cartoon form. On December 24, 1994, the Xenu story was published on the internet for the first time in a posting to the Usenet news group called alt.religion.scientology through an anonymous remailer. This led to an online battle between the Church of Scientology lawyers and detractors. Older versions of the OT levels 1 through 8 were brought as exhibits attached to a declaration by Steve Fishman on April 9, 1993, as part of the Church of Scientology International versus Fishman and Gertz. The text of this declaration and its exhibits, collectively known as the Fishman Affidavit, were posted to the internet news group alt.religion.scientology in August 1995 by Arnie Lerma and on the World Wide Web by David S. Turetsky. This was the subject of great controversy and legal battles for several years. There was a copyright raid on Lerma's house, leading to massive mirroring of the documents, and a suit against Dutch writer Karen Spake, the church bringing suit on copyright violation grounds for reproducing the source material and also claiming rewordings would reveal a trade secret. The Church of Scientology's attempts to keep Xenu secret have been cited in court findings against it. In September 2003, a Dutch court, in the ruling in the case against Corinne Spake, stated that one objective in keeping OT2 and OT3 secret was to wield power over members of the Church of Scientology and prevent discussion about its teachings and practices. Despite his claims that premature revelations of the OT3 story was lethal, L. Ron Hubbard wrote a screenplay version under the title Revolt in the Stars in the 1970s. This revealed that Xenu had been assisted by beings named Chi, the Galactic Minister of Police, and Chu, the Executive President of the Galactic Interplanetary Bank. It's not been officially published, although the treatment was circulated around Hollywood in the early 1980s, and unofficial copies of the screenplay circulate on the internet. So, the reason that I point this out is that until recently, the general public was unaware of any entity called Xenu. Sure, there might have been mention here or there in a book or in an obscure lawsuit, but it was unlikely that Jack Kirby, who died in 1994, or even Stan Lee, who died in 2018, had heard of that particular Scientology story or made any connection between it and a story that they had published in 1960. Even if they or someone at Marvel Comics did know about it and wanted to sue the Church of Scientology, until recently that church was known to be very litigious. Why would Marvel or Kirby or Lee want to get involved in a lawsuit against the Church of Scientology over a long-forgotten story? The headaches from the harassment and legal cost would likely not be worth it in my mind. Let's turn to Arthur Conan Doyle and his creation of Sherlock Holmes for a moment by looking at a milestone lawsuit in the case. Klinger versus Conan Doyle Estate Limited was a 2014 decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit in response to an appeal filed by the defendants against the 2013 ruling of the U.S. District Court for Northern District of Illinois. These decisions by the District Court and the Court of the Seventh Circuit clarified the validity under copyright law of the use of characters of Sherlock Holmes and his colleague Dr. John Watson and the story elements in unlicensed works. Further, the scope of using characters in the public domain was also clarified. The courts held that the characters of Holmes and Watson had entered the public domain along with the story elements of the works on which the copyright protection had expired. i.e., published prior to 1923. Hence, they could be used in subsequent works without procuring a license. However, the copyright protection in works published in and after 1923 was still valid, and the unique expressions found in those works could still not be used without the permission of the defendants until the work's copyrights expire. So the background. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle authored 4 novels and 56 stories featuring Holmes and Watson, sometimes referred to as the canon, published between 1887 and 1927. The Conan Doyle estate was a company owned by certain collateral descendants of Conan Doyle and others, which claims ownership of certain intellectual property rights to Conan Doyle's works and grants licenses to these rights. In 2013, 50 of the 60 canonical stories were in the public domain in the United States because their copyrights had expired. The remaining 10 stories, first published in magazines and later published in book form in the Case Book of Sherlock Holmes, remained under copyright in the United States under the Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998, which extended the copyright term for certain works published in and after 1923 to 95 years from their original publication date. The copyrights on these 10 stories expired from 2019 to 2023 on the first day of the year, dubbed Public Domain Day. As of January 1st, 2023, all canonical Sherlock Holmes works are in the public domain in the United States. Leslie S. Klinger co-edited an anthology of original Sherlock Holmes pastiches titled A Study in Sherlock, which was published in 2011 by Random House. The stories in A Study in Sherlock were inspired by the Sherlock Holmes canon and included canonical characters and elements. Further, the anthology was published, or before the anthology was published, the Conan Doyle estate asserted to Random House that the estate had exclusive rights to use the characters of Holmes and Watson, and if Random House intended to publish the anthology, it needed to enter into a licensing agreement with the estate. Random House signed a licensing agreement with the estate before publishing the anthology. Klinger then co-edited a sequel to A Study in Sherlock, a second anthology titled In the Company of Sherlock Holmes. This book was also a compilation of short stories inspired and influenced by Sherlock Holmes' canon. This book was to be published by Pegasus Books and distributed by W. Norton and Company. When the estate learned of this book's impending publication, it contacted Pegasus Books, asserting that if Pegasus intended to publish the work legally, it needed to obtain a license from the estate. The estate wrote, quote, "If you proceed instead to bring out the book unlicensed, do not expect to see it offered for sale by Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and similar retailers. We work with those companies routinely to weed out unlicensed uses of Sherlock Holmes from their authoring, and we will not hesitate to do so with your book as well," unquote. Klinger believed that he did not need to obtain and pay for a license from the estate because the characters of Holmes and Watson had already entered the public domain and hence could be freely used. However, Pegasus Books was concerned about the communication that it had received from the estate and did not finalize its contract to publish the book. To address the issue, Klinger filed a copyright lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, sitting in Chicago, against the Conan Doyle estate. The lawsuit sought declaratory judgment under the Declaratory Judgment Act, determining that Klinger could legally publish In the Company of Sherlock Holmes without paying the estate for a license. As far as the Conan Doyle estate was concerned, they did not agree with successive court rulings and tried to take it to the Supreme Court, where it was denied. Implications. The ruling of Klinger versus Conan Doyle Estates Limited allows authors of derivative works to use characters and expressions in works which have entered into the public domain. Thus, a character which has been modified in subsequent works does not get a perpetual copyright. The copyright protection in subsequent works is limited to the original contributions, which the court identifies as increment of expression, and does not extend the copyright protection of characters or expressions that appeared in the original work. So, I think that covers a lot of recent copyright law as it relates to some of the characters that you talk about. For a while, some of the Sherlock Holmes stories were not in the public domain, but public ones, or rather, some of them were in the public domain, but later ones were not. And those particular ones had characteristic developments that modern day writers utilized in their own works, which should then cause them to run afoul of certain aspects of the copyright law. But as of today, in the United States and perhaps some other political jurisdictions, all of the Sherlock Holmes stories written by Conan Doyle are now in the public domain. Of course, because other countries may have different copyright laws, publishing a book in the United States based on someone else's characters may be legal, while selling it in other countries may not, because the characters may still be under copyright in those jurisdictions. I think it's a very interesting subject, but not necessarily one that most of my viewers want to do a deep dive into, so I'll end here on that topic. Let's move on to another comment. This one is about the ongoing discussion within the D.B. Cooper community, which I call the Cooper sphere, concerning whether Richard Floyd McCoy was also the skyjacker known to history as D.B. Cooper. Ed, another longtime viewer and commenter, writes, I just don't understand why some people want to hang on to the belief that McCoy was Cooper. Now, I could see both sides of this. As I point out many times, I made a video early on in my YouTube career stating that based on watching Dan Greider's first video concerning McCoy as Cooper, that I was convinced that that was the case. I had at least one kind viewer write to me and point out some of the flaws, and I did more research of the case, and then I became convinced that Cooper and McCoy were in fact not the same person. That almost everything about the two cases was really different. Sure, the plane was the same type of plane, and having the fuel truck park in the same general position was the same. But as I point out, you'd want the fuel truck to be in a certain position relative to the plane so that you, as the hijacker, could keep an eye on the people fueling the plane and keeping them as far away as possible. So that in no way is a piece of evidence linking the two. And then later watching Dan Greider's second video with an open mind, yet still critiquing each piece of evidence that he gives, it's clear that there is no hard evidence and scant circumstantial evidence. For instance, the parachutes that Greider finds in McCoy's mother's barn on the East Coast have been pointed out by many people in online forums that they cannot be the same parachutes and have the wrong hardware. And I think by now Dan has realized his mistake there, because he does not seem to be publicizing what would otherwise be the holy grail, the parachute that really would solve the D.B. Cooper case. And in my mind, a lot of the evidence that he shows contradicts what he actually thinks is being indicated. And as I've pointed those things out publicly, Mr. Greider has been disparaging of me, and that's fine. But to answer your comment further, I think for many people it's very difficult for them to admit that they've made a mistake or to be open to new information. All of the big unsolved cases, like Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac and the Black Dahlia and the D.B. Cooper case, often lack many pieces of hard evidence, but are full of all kinds of what seem to be clues, but whose chain of custody or provenance or legitimacy seem to be in question. It takes a lot of time going through the material that's been written on these cases and trying to find original sources, and often what you find out is clues and information don't originate from the time of the crime but crop up much later. I think anybody that's ever read a newspaper article about themselves or something closely connected to them realizes how often inaccurate things, either facts or interpretations, can creep into newspaper articles. And often newspaper articles are called the so-called first draft of history. So when the first draft has errors in it, any subsequent draft is likely going to repeat those errors. And that's understandable because reporters are humans and humans make mistakes. Members of law enforcement or the FBI or Scotland Yard can make mistakes. I'm not one who believes much along the lines of government cover-ups in these cases. I think when investigators drop the ball, it's because they're human and make mistakes generally. I don't think that there's an FBI cover-up trying to protect the identity of Cooper. I don't think that there is a cover-up by Freemasons to thwart the Ripper investigation. I don't think that the Zodiac or Charles Manson really have an MK Ultra connection to the CIA. Do you have cases where there's corruption within police forces? Sure. Do prosecutors manufacture or hide evidence sometimes? Unfortunately, the answer is probably yes. But unless you find a legitimate, authentic smoking gun, a document of unimpeachable authority by Charles Warren stating that the Prime Minister has ordered him not to proceed further with the case because Freemasons murdered these women to protect the Duke of Clarence, then we can't assume such far-fetched and fantastic conspiracy theories. But again, as I point out, there really is so much information out there that one really needs to study to get to be to a competent level in understanding of even one of these cases. And so it's easy just to find a suspect that you're convinced is the perpetrator and then make up your mind to accept that and close your mind off to any evidence to the contrary. That's just human nature, and that's what you're going to get with many people on the internet. And that's okay, because all of us discussing these cases on the internet probably are not going to lead to anything, but it is dangerous when police or prosecutors make such a leap in logic and settle upon one particular person while ignoring any other exculpatory or contradictory evidence in a case. And I'm sure that this is not the last time that there'll be a discussion about McCoy being Cooper, but for now I'll end here, and thank you very much for that comment. I certainly agree with your sentiments. Here's another one about Cooper, in particular concerning if anyone stopped paying FICA or income tax after Thanksgiving 1971. Certainly, this might be a way to find some potential suspects, and that's assuming that D.B. Cooper perished in the skyjacking and so did not return to a job and continue earning income and paying taxes. I'm of the belief that it was likely that Cooper died, perhaps ending up in the Columbia, which would explain why some of the money was found, possibly dredged up later and deposited on the bank of Tina Bar. I understand some issues with him ending up in the Columbia based on where the drop site is thought to be, but as we all know from discussions, people are still not all on the same page as to where the plane was when he may have exited. I proposed, and other people have also, so I'm not the only one that's come up with this, but I think it's likely that Cooper was not employed immediately prior to the skyjacking. Some researchers have pointed out that some of the identified suspects were or could have been unemployed at the time, and of course, if the skyjacker was somebody who was currently unidentified, they could well have been recently laid off or chronically unemployed prior to the Cooper skyjacking. Or, according to the Gunther book, which is an interesting read but highly dubious, so should be taken with a grain of salt, the suspect in that case had long been using a fake social security number or making money under the table, which would thwart trying to use tax records at the time to locate a suspect. I've never read anything online or in a book about the FBI trying to use databases of tax records to identify a suspect, and I don't know if there is a comprehensive collection of easily searchable computer databases of tax collections of all types from that date in 1971. It's certainly a good idea, but I don't know if it is possible even by government employees. But thanks again. Here's a comment from Paul, another longtime viewer and commenter. Again, I pretty much agree with you 100%. I think it's likely that he did die, although again, I've not closed my mind off to the possibility that whomever Cooper was, that he might have survived, and if so, he might have gone on to be one of the identified suspects, such as Ted Braden. It is interesting to see in discussions, either in other people's videos or within the comments section of my own, how some people will argue that this terrain is heavily forested and in some areas quite treacherous, and other people will argue that this area where the plane flew over was not nearly the way that people describe it to be. And that also is the argument that sometimes comes from people who claim to be from the area. And I've been to the area, and I live in a suburb of Portland, so I'm not totally unaware of how it looks, but it's kind of like the weather on any particular day. If it's a little overcast, do you describe it as partly sunny or partly cloudy? Two different people can have quite a differing opinion on the weather depending on whether they mind clouds or not. And I think that we have to remember that this case was over 50 years ago now, and looking at maps, even satellite maps of the area, there's going to be a lot more development and a lot less forest now than there used to be. And one last thing before I end on this comment. I used to watch a lot of those missing person in the forest videos. Some of them got annoying after a while, with the creators of those videos always defaulting to supernatural forces or Bigfoot or UFOs taking the people as an explanation for why the bodies were never found. But sometimes you have cases, which are a bit mysterious, where you have a body found in an area that had to have been searched by searchers and somehow missed. And that's assuming that the body wasn't put there after the search. But sometimes you have bodies that were found on the other side of a log in an area where searchers had searched, but for some reason probably had overlooked a little area covered up by bushes on the other side of a log. Nothing sinister about that, just that the body eventually was found, but not at the time of the original search. In the D.B. Cooper case, it's now believed that the original area of search, identified by the FBI, was farther north than it should have been. Current researchers believe that the search area should have been just to the south of that. Certainly, if Cooper ended up in the Columbia, then it should have been even farther south of where the researchers think that the jump site was. I agree with you. Cooper's body, if it landed on land, let us say for whatever reason the parachute didn't open, and he fell into a large blackberry bush and is continuing to grow after 50 years, if the parachute hadn't opened up, even if somebody flew over soon after that in a helicopter and looked down, they wouldn't have seen the body. And I've read online articles quoting people that live in the area that stayed as much. So, is it quite possible that he ended up in the Columbia River? Yes. Is it equally possible that he somehow ended up on land and perished and people just haven't found him yet? I think that's completely reasonable also. And again, it may be that he survived, lost a little bit of the money, and perhaps kept the rest and spent it, and it was never detected in circulation. Here's a comment concerning the Zodiac. It was left on one of my videos discussing some thoughts about one of the symbols supposedly used by the Zodiac in a card to Paul Avery. This comment is from Jake Daniel and says, "The Zodiac has been discovered and is in the new book Finding the Zodiac Killer by David Daniel." Now, I'm guessing that Jake Daniel may be related to the author of the book, David Daniel. I googled that book, and while I saw it advertised for sale, I did not see, after much searching, whom the proposed subject was. Now, since I haven't read the book and I don't know anything about it, perhaps the author really has definitively proven who the Zodiac Killer was. I can't sit here and say that that's not the case. I will point out that plenty of people have written books, and many of them have identified various individuals whom they believe definitively was the Zodiac Killer. Unfortunately, they can't all be right. Perhaps one of them is correct, but I think that most people, although not all, but most people believe that the 4 canonical Zodiac crimes were committed by one individual, or perhaps one individual with the knowledge of another, such as Arthur Lee Allen and Don Chaney. But for now, I'm going to keep an open mind, and as far as thinking that the Zodiac case has not yet definitively been solved, but I think that because we may well have DNA from people licking stamps on letters that were sent to individuals or newspapers by the Zodiac, and I believe that they were sent by the Zodiac because some of them contained pieces of Paul Stein's bloody shirt, that eventually the case might get solved. So, thank you very much for taking the time to comment here. Okay, I think I'll end up here. This has gotten longer than I had intended. Just one last observation. I've been doing these videos for a couple years. It's kind of interesting how some of them really go viral, at least on a relative level compared to my other videos, and how some start getting views long after they were first posted. I point out a recent example over the last few days of a short that I did about the George Smiley character from John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spies movie. I would love to hear your thoughts on whatever you'd like to comment about. If you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button. I can finally get this channel monetized when I get another 150 more subscribers, so hopefully we'll be able to do that by the end of the year. If you like this and any of my other videos, please do hit the like button also. Thanks again, and hope to hear from you soon.